The Desdemona incident. One of the turning points of New Avalon's history occurred near the end of the Civil War, when the local militia of a town called Desdemona invited a would-be dictator named Jurgensen to be military protector of their district. Flushed with his success in a few recent battles, Captain Adalbert Jurgensen was on the verge of declaring himself military dictator, which took most residents of Desdemona completely by surprise. Those who did speak out in protest were split as to the means they should take to oppose him. The two factions were called the Gandhists and the activists. The former practiced passive resistance, as prescribed by their hero, the Tehran social theorist Mohandas Gandhi. The activists insisted on immediately taking up arms against any potential dictator who came along. At the time of Jurgensen's coup, Desdemona was already a city of 150,000 people, with a permanent, professional police force in addition to its volunteer militia. The captain entered the city like a Roman emperor, trailing an entourage half a kilometer long, and the people of the city lined the sidewalks along his route. Jurgensen was standing up in a car, waving to the procession, while the police did their traditional duty of holding back the crowd and otherwise keeping order. As Jurgensen's procession approached the town square, one of the Gandhists sneaked past the police line and moved to sit down with great dignity in the middle of the road before Jurgensen's led car. Several vehicles back, Jurgensen nearly toppled face first into the front seat of his car as the vehicles pulled up sharply. The young protester announced in a loud, clear voice that he had no weapons to oppose the soldiers entering his town, but that they would only rule over his dead body. When Jurgensen was informed of the announcement, he said, "Very well, then. Make him dead." The soldiers opened fire and killed the young man, and the parade rolled on. Then the same thing happened again. When a young woman sat in the road and announced that the soldiers would rule over her dead body, she was killed, and the parade rolled on. After an old woman and another young man were killed, one of the activists took more forceful action. Slipping past the police line, he drew a gun and took a policeman hostage. Dragging the officer to the center of the road, the activist made the same announcement that the Gandhist martyrs had made, but he shielded his body with the policeman's. By this time, Jurgensen was exasperated and bellowed that anyone who got in his way, voluntarily or not, would be cut down. No one expected such ruthless stupidity from the man who was supposed to put an end to the violence of the Civil War. When the soldiers opened fire on the young activist and his hostage, both the police and the town militia began to return fire. The crowd on the sidewalk scattered for cover, as the local militia routed the better armed and better trained soldiers by the sheer fury of their response. Jurgensen was killed along with half his force, and the soldiers retreated back into the countryside. Jurgensen's aide-de-camp, who took over upon Jurgensen's death, was more intelligent. He sent apologies to the town of Desdemona and especially to the relatives of those who were killed. He also pledged that his soldiers would never again enter the town except as protectors of the peace. Desdemona had shown that a mere show of force was not enough to subjugate a people who loved their freedom. The Desdemona incident, as it came to be known, was an inspiration for the planet's freedom fighters for centuries to come. Foundations of a dynasty. Davion's role in the rebellion has been largely suppressed, partly by patriots, who preferred not to give too much credit to a Tehran malcontent, and later by the Davion family itself. Despite Davion's invaluable assistance in freeing New Avalon from Tehran domination, some of his new compatriots never trusted him entirely. They believed that if he could betray one government, he might just as easily betray another. This did not worry Robert Davion, who married Suzanne Marzine in 2239. In one stroke, he became one of the richest and most powerful men on the planet. When no children were born to this union, Robert's first son Adam became the scion of a first family, eventually to emerge as the head of the Marzines. Few official Davion family histories deal with Robert, the man who laid the foundation for all the family's fortunes. As a captain in the Alliance Colonial Marines, he did not easily fit the mold of a hero of the rebellion. His motivations were always too obscure, his intentions too uncertain, and his actions too blatantly self-serving to elevate him to the status of a Washington, a Lee, or a Haske. Lord Robert proved to be a master opportunist, however. The plans he laid during New Avalon's struggle for independence would yield far more than he would ever know, for it took several generations for his seeds to reach fruition. Davion's ambitions and goals seemed to have shifted and turned with each new development. There is no doubt that he sympathized with the colonists on New Avalon. He never behaved as anything but a friend to the locals and avoided the Marine pose of aloof superiority. It was through such fraternizing that he met Suzanne Marzine, fell in love, and gained even more attachment to his new home and its people. It may be that he never considered what Suzanne's wealth and influential family connections would mean to him. Robert Davion never attempted to enter public life, knowing that his adopted people would find it difficult to accept leadership from someone associated with their former oppressor, no matter how many services he had rendered them. Instead, he used the Marzine family's influence to groom his own son for power. By 2245, the handsome 20-year-old Adam Davion had already been elected titular colonel of the 4th Regiment of the New Avalon Militia. Though it was common practice for first families to secure such appointments for their children, Robert had his own motives. Among his private papers are many expressions of contempt for the first families and their power blocks. Their only real use to Davion were as stepping stones to advance the fortunes of his own kin. Shortly after Adam's election to militia colonel, the political tensions on New Avalon exploded. Robert Davion responded to Jason Haske's call to arms by becoming a military advisor at the Battle of Lockhart Manor. It is said that Davion advised Haske to attack before the opposition could bring up reinforcements, but Haske ignored the advice and lost the battle. Captain Lord Robert Davion was killed in the fight to protect Haske when the militia command post was overrun. That left Adam as heir to Robert's plans and aspirations, a young man of 21 with the authority, but not necessarily the experience, to become a leader of men. First Families War. Adam Davion was an enigma. Though nepotism shaped his early life, it seemed unlikely that he could turn his advantages into personal success. When the Civil War broke out between the first families, young Davion had a wife and an infant son. His stepmother, the last of the blood Marzines, was still alive but could contribute little protection to the tiny family. Disaster loomed before young Adam, who responded by taking the only course to safety. He saved himself and his family, but at the price of being called a coward. Although the Marzines were a strong force in the pre-war economic life of New Avalon, they were ill-prepared to fight. Robert Davion had not believed in private armies, and Adam had neither the time nor the talent to forge a fighting force out of the Marzine retainers when the crisis came. He and his stepmother chose instead to adopt an awkward neutrality. In exchange for steel and Marzine mills, Adam negotiated pledges of protection from the three strongest factions. Thus protected from the rivalries of the other first families, Davion bided his time and remained aloof from the fighting that his militia commission required him to oppose. He spent his time courting a fourth faction, that of Colonel Nathan Duval, which had considerable military strength but a poor industrial base. Duval, 10 years senior to Davion, had been a popular militia colonel before the war. After the Battle of Lockhart Manor, he had rallied remnants of the colonial militia and joined them to his own family army. This gave Duval a dubious claim to legitimacy as the senior surviving representative of the planetary government. By himself, however, he still lacked the power to take on any of the other factions. Davion approached Duval with an offer of support following the latter's defeat at Owen's Ford on South Cont. In a secret alliance, Davion/Marzine retainers began to swell the ranks of Duval's planetary militia. Davion also began to negotiate with other less powerful First Family factions, starting with the Bulows, his wife's relations, to forge an alliance. To the horror of his stepmother, Adam even brought in the Lockhart family, whom she blamed for Robert Davion's death. After several months of behind-the-scenes maneuvering, this alliance managed to coordinate their military activity enough to begin to turn the tide of war. Duval maintained titular leadership of the coalition, but Adam Davion was never far from the seat of power. It was Adam's hand, not Duval's, that signed the Truce of Loch Rivin vow that ended the Civil War. Hidden Counselor. In the years that followed, Davion continued to take a back seat to Nathan Duval, but his wishes played an important part in the writing of the Second Covenant, the new constitution, and the reorganization of the new Avalon government. Davion held no post in the new government, and appeared to settle down to a quiet life on his stepmother's estate. Nonetheless, it was Adam Davion, not Nathan Duval, who held together the coalition of First Families while Duval was building his political power base. Duval never forgot Davion's importance to his success. Throughout the Lockhart and Cartwright administrations, Davion received the best contracts and the most government support for economic expansion. The alliance between the two families was completely sealed in 2268, when Adam's son Jerome married Duval's daughter Jennifer. This placed Jerome in a position nearly equal to that of Nathan's own son Martin as heir to the Duval political mantle. Neither Adam nor Jerome Davion took leading roles in Avalonian politics thereafter, but each contributed in his own way. It was a Davion-owned plant that assembled the Nurse Hope Ewell and 3 other ships in New Avalon's trading fleet. From 2297 to 2306, Jerome Davion served as ambassador to El Dorado, a vital trading partner in New Avalon's growing commercial interstellar empire. He was killed when his ship, the jump courier Jason Haske, blew up during the journey home to New Avalon in 2306. Jerome left behind 4 sons, Lucien, Joseph, Louis, and Charles. At the time of his father's death, Lucien Davion was already high in the government of Martin Duval. In 2307, the next year, the childless Prime Minister appointed Lucien to the key post of Deputy Prime Minister. With this act, another major crisis nearly erupted among the First Families. As the son of Nathan Duval's daughter Jennifer, Lucien was Martin Duval's closest blood relative. Yet many Duval cousins insisted that any dynasty of Duval prime ministers should pass down through those bearing the family name. Most of the argument was secret, for no one had yet acknowledged the concept of an inherited prime ministry. Lucien strengthened his power base in the Chamber of Deputies by marrying Marie Fabia, whose grandfather had been the strongest of the anti-coalition warlords in the Civil War. When his son was born, Lucien named him Reynard, after his maternal grandfather, a clear indication of where Lucien was counting on getting fresh support. In a single generation, the power of the Davions on New Avalon had eclipsed that of the Duvals. Birth of a federation. I fear the growth of a subtle dictatorship far more than the return of the Terrans. We have long watched the Duvals forging shackles for the rest of us to wear. I say that the choice of this ambassador's son as Prime Minister is the final link in forging the chains that we shall be compelled to wear for all time to come. Jason Haske III, in a letter to an unknown correspondent, 2307. Lucien Davion was elected Prime Minister of New Avalon within a week of Martin Duval's death. It is testimony to Davion's reputation that not even his harshest critics credited rumors that he had something to do with the hunting accident that took Duval's life. Though Lucien's talent for political maneuvering made him both hated and feared, he was also respected as a man of principle and honor who would never stoop to betrayal. Lucien had little in common with other members of his family. Soft-spoken and intensely idealistic, he was a sincere proponent of reform and of expansion to the stars. He was also an orator of considerable skill, with a flair for statesmanship and compromise. Nevertheless, he owed much of his early political success to his younger brothers. Louis Davion, in particular, was a born schemer who had concocted the idea of marriage with the Fabian family to win Lucien the post of deputy prime minister. United, the Davion brothers were a formidable political team. The new prime minister devoted his first few years in office to developing the policies begun under the two Duvals. New Avalon was well on its way to extensive industrialization, and the growing trading fleet was plying the star systems within 2 jumps of the planet. Trade brought economic prosperity and an inflow of raw materials for the expanding industries. Even though the first families were steadily losing their monopoly on economic power, Lucien's popularity increased among the oligarchs as their profits mounted. Fear of a stagnant, polarized feudal society taking root on New Avalon soon began to fade. In its place, however, came concern over the long-term effects of runaway inflation as interstellar wealth-based local currency and the upper classes became increasingly decadent. Mechina's hegemony. In 2314, 6 years after Lucien became prime minister, a bloody civil war broke out on Terra. In the wake of an armed clash between the expansionist and liberal parties, the Terran alliance collapsed. To restore order, Fleet Admiral James Mechina stepped in at the head of the alliance military. The charismatic Mechina created a new order from the death of the old, naming it the Terran hegemony. Dedicated to the restoration of Terra as the center of the human sphere, Mechina's new government stimulated interest in the former Terran colonies, which could only spell trouble for those worlds. Where the Terran alliance had withered in influence, the hegemony began to expand and soon had regained control of more than 100 worlds. Lucien Davion knew only too well that if a resurgent Terra decided to pick off the colonial worlds one by one, there would be little any single planet could do to stop her. Independent for less than a century, New Avalon was as vulnerable to takeover as any other world. In a series of swift and decisive moves, he began to contact other worlds of the Crucice Reach, who had no reason to love Terra. Though none had gone through armed revolt, or had suffered when the Alliance had withdrawn from her colonies in 2237, leaving them to sink or swim. Homo Stellaris, whom Mechina had extolled in speeches on Terra, had grown up without help from Terra. Now his offspring were hostile to the idea of surrendering their autonomy to the Terrans again, after making it through the hard years of what had already become known as the Exodus. It did not take much to manipulate those hostilities and fears, and Lucien Davion was the man who could do it best. In a whirlwind interstellar tour begun in 2316, Davion visited each world of the Crucice Reach. His theme was constant: one world could not resist Terra, but many standing together could. He stressed the idea that a show of independence early in the crisis would keep the threat of interstellar conflict from materializing. The fledgling hegemony was not yet strong enough to fight a major war at the end of a light-years-long supply line. Mechina's government would try instead to pick off weak planets through threats, economic sanctions, or small armed demonstrations. Lucien was persuasive, and it won him many supporters. The Crucice Pact. Our one world cannot stand alone any longer. We must reach out, forge new bonds, and seek friends among the stars, so that our children can stay strong and free. Lucien Davion in a speech in support of the Crucice Pact, 2317. It is important to understand that Davion took special pains to identify himself completely with the plan. On some worlds, he conducted his meetings with local authorities, not as Prime Minister of New Avalon, but as a private citizen concerned for the future of the Reach. By 2317, he was ready to convene a summit conference of leaders from 23 planets. The conference lasted for 3 long months, but when it finally broke up, all but 3 participating governments had agreed to sign the historic treaty that became known as the Crucice Pact. creating a mutual defense and trade union known as the Federated Suns. The treaty ensured complete local autonomy for all member planets. It also offered the benefits of favorable trade terms, military assistance, and an assembly known as the High Council for the discussion of issues and the settlement of disputes between members. Hanse Davion was unanimously chosen as president of the new body, a tribute to his personal popularity and his crucial role in calling together the summit and drafting the terms of the pact. The Successor Pact embodied a number of high ideals that Hanse Davion genuinely valued. At the same time, it was so loaded with amendments ensuring local jurisdiction that it was virtually useless. One 24th century historian referred to it as the only document to make the League of Nations Charter look practical. Despite its flaws, the pact worked well, thanks to Davion's tireless efforts. He delegated most of his presidential duties on New Avalon to his brothers, which freed him to travel from planet to planet in pursuit of a workable interstellar governmental system. His reputation for impartiality and his statesmanship helped Hanse Davion obtain the cooperation of even the most unruly member, while adding several new worlds to the Federation. The Successor Pact of 2317 sparked a number of similar mutual defense and trading pacts elsewhere in the human sphere, but few developed as smoothly or functioned as well in these early years as the Federated Suns. In the 15 years between the signing of the Successor Pact and Hanse Davion's death in 2332, the first president of the Federated Suns turned the loose association of planets into a union of closely allied worlds. In the process, the presidency became synonymous with the Davion name. After Hanse's death, there still existed enough petty rivalries between member worlds to make it difficult for them to agree on anything without their president's mediation, but the name of Davion was magic. Hanse's youngest brother Charles, though hardly in a class with his respected elder, became a prime candidate for president of the Federated Suns. It was only after Charles had secured that post that he announced his intention to stand as New Avalon's prime minister. Hanse had not appointed any of his family members as deputy prime minister, for his brothers had acted as his personal representatives without benefit of specific office. Now the Chamber of Deputies was once more reluctant to allow a dynasty to control the prime ministry. For a time, they seemed bent on selecting one of the Hanse line to show their defiance of the Davion power base. It was the talented Louis who changed their minds in a speech full of veiled references to the growing importance of the Federated Suns. His threats were unspoken, but they came through loud and clear. No Avalonian wanted to see his world abandoned as the capital of the newly created Federated Suns, and many feared that the Davions would use their influence to stir up bad feelings between New Avalon and the other member worlds of the Pact. After making the last serious attempt to stand up to the Davion family, the Chamber of Deputies finally backed down. Though the first families of New Avalon would continue to produce important leaders, their political power dwindled, leaving the Chamber of Deputies little more than a rubber stamp for Davion decisions and policies. It is ironic that Hanse Davion, the idealist who used all his skill and charm to forge a workable union of worlds, was the one responsible for the death of individual liberty on his home world. Was he blind to where his actions might one day lead, or did he believe that his own family's dominion would be less damaging to New Avalon and the Federated Suns than would a Lyran takeover? In the years of the Davion family's consolidation of power on New Avalon, other influential leaders might have offered a challenge to their meteoric rise. That these others failed to block the Davion advance is testimony both to the skill of 4 successive generations of Davion politicians and proof of the fear of infighting in an oligarchic society. From start to finish, the Davion family's single most powerful weapon was the fact that their potential opposition was unwilling to unite against them. Among the major first families, several names stand out. The Belows and the Fabiers were particularly influential, between them dominating New Avalon's communications and electronics industries. The Davions chose to make ties of marriage with each of these two families, marriages that strengthened the Davion power base and industrial empire as well. Starting with Robert and Adam, love matches took a back seat to political considerations for many Davions during the late 23rd and early 24th centuries. It was through such marriages that they diffused political rivalries while strengthening their own voting bloc. Though many important scions of first families would crop up later in the history of the Federated Suns, including Hanse, Davion, and even some descendants of Governor-General Varney, none would ever have a chance of dislodging the Davions. The Prime Ministers. Sometimes, it is hard for social historians to judge the causes and effects of change. On Arcadia, another, garden world, of the Crucice March, peace and prosperity were the watchwords even in the worst years of the Terran retreat from her former colonies. The planet's plentiful water, extensive agriculture, abundant raw materials, and booming industrial economy made Arcadia the logical heart of the new Federated Suns. But it was struggling, strife-ridden New Avalon that emerged as the lead planet of the inner sphere's most powerful state. Why did the poorer world succeed over the richer? Perhaps it was a matter of harsher conditions breeding tougher people, or of luxury blinding the Arcadian rulers to the need to expand aggressively. In the long run, though, New Avalon's fortunes were built solidly on the foundations laid by a single family, the Davions. If the Davions had emigrated to another world, would history have awarded New Avalon another band of visionary leaders? Or would the family have emerged on any planet they settled as the dominant influence in the politics of their region of space? That is a question historians will never be able to answer. From the Dynamics of History, by Louise Charbini, Nes Press, New Avalon, 3018. New Avalon's transition from single world to capital of an interstellar federation went smoothly under the leadership of the first three Davion prime ministers. Though differing from one another in superficial ways, each succeeding Davion contributed to the growth of New Avalon and of the Federated Suns. Between them, they also displayed the best and worst traits of a family whose footsteps would echo down another 700 years of peril, strife, and triumph. Hanse Davion, visionary leader, Prime Minister of New Avalon and President of the Federated Suns, Hanse Davion stands out as the pivotal figure in his family's rise to power. Though earlier Davions had played their own important roles, Hanse was the quintessential Davion hero, whose appearance at a crucial hour of history saved New Avalon and the whole of the Crucice Reach. The first president of the Federated Suns was quite different from the rest of his family. Indeed, there were stories later rigidly suppressed that Hanse was not really the son of Jerome Davion at all, but of Jason Hanse too. Though he shared the famed Hanse qualities of idealism and incorruptible honesty, these tales do not seem to contain much truth. Neither Robert nor Adam Davion was quite sterling as a character, but Hanse's father, Jerome, taught his son high standards of personal and professional conduct. Jerome Davion, the soft-spoken ambassador, had never been well known in New Avalon society. Though he taught Hanse well, two of his other sons, Louis and Charles, were a pair of schemers who would have made their grandfather Adam proud. For Hanse, power and prestige were a means to an end, not ends in themselves. He used his power to forge an interstellar union that he honestly believed was vital to the survival of New Avalon and the other worlds of the Crucice Reach. He seems never to have grasped that others, even members of his own family, were not equally visionary. They saw Hanse as a pawn to build a Davion dynasty rather than a folk hero come to save his world. From History of the Davions, by Enrico Rosario, Nova Press Interstellar, 3015. A dream fulfilled. I see a day when the Mother of Worlds will acknowledge that her children have surpassed her, when the children of the stars shall claim a rightful place as equals rather than as colonial subjects alongside the children of Earth. I see a time of peace and prosperity embracing not one world but 1,000 worlds. Most of all, I see a day when unity in the common cause of freedom will create an age when no world need suffer from hardships or famines or internal strife, because 1,000 brother worlds will be standing by to provide the support needed to weather the bad times or to enjoy the good. Hanse Davion, from a speech to the New Avalon Chamber of Deputies, 2317. Hanse was the dreamer, the statesman who forged a federation of worlds and made it work during the first critical years of growth. His diplomatic success was due as much to an admirable personality and reputation for integrity as to his natural talents as a negotiator. In his day, the Davion wisdom became a byword among populations who had never heard of New Avalon, but had come to love the first president of the Federated Suns for his fair and honest judgment of complicated interworld disputes. Hanse's charm could not smooth over the difficulties of one situation, however. In 2318, the commander of Muskegon, sovereign ruler of that planet and its colonial offshoots in the border area of the Crucice Reach, joined the Federated Suns as a full member of the council. The colonies of Emerson and Beaton Kaitos were growing restive under the impersonal government of Muskegon, however, and were refusing to obey the edicts that were part of the laws of the Federated Suns. Many of the rebellious colonial leaders believed that the two planets should fall more naturally under the protection of the Chesterton trade worlds, another new interstellar community forming in the shadow of Terram resurgence. The colonies declared their independence of Muskegon and signed agreements with Chesterton soon after the commander announced his decision. The decision to turn away from the Suns in favor of another interstellar power was to cost these two worlds dearly, with far-reaching implications down to the present-day reigns of Hanse Davion and Maximilian Liao some 7 centuries later. Muskegon. In 2163, a group of Terran colonists had set out for Mechwarrior, a recently opened colony world. A malfunction of the colony ship's Kearney Fuchida drive forced the colonists to desert the jump ship in the Muskegon star system. The single marginally habitable planet of that system became the new home for nearly 1,000,000 people. Conditions on Muskegon were harsh, and so only harsh measures could overcome them. Because they controlled systems vital to survival, the captain and crew of the colony jump ship set themselves up as leaders with absolute power over the other colonists. Within a few generations, Muskegon society had polarized into a crew class of aristocrats and a colonist class of workers. The office of Expedition Commander, now known as Commander of Muskegon, had become hereditary and was vested with near-dictatorial powers. The people endured, however, and the colony prospered despite the severe conditions of their home world. Thanks to stern measures taken in the earliest days of the colony, knowledge was retained even when it was not immediately useful. The rebirth of technology waited only for industrialization. In 2177, technicians succeeded in repairing the original colony jump ship. A volunteer crew departed in this vessel with orders to seek out a better world on which to transplant the colony. Instead, the expedition found Emerson and Beaton Kaitos, planets rich in natural resources but whose environmental conditions were not much better than Muskegon's. A shipload of deportees and political prisoners colonized Emerson, while volunteer colonists settled Beaton Kaitos. In both cases, the new colonies were ruled by the government of Muskegon, which exploited the new worlds without providing much support for the needy colonists. Raw materials from the two colonies helped build additional ships for the fleet at home, and these in turn were used to found other colonies on nearby planets. By 2190, Muskegon claimed 6 planets. The commander of Muskegon was absolute ruler over these worlds through a network of governors chosen from the crew class. Emerson's ties to Muskegon were weak because its first settlers had been deported criminals. When a ship from the Chesterton Trade League arrived in 2195, the Emersonians with the tacit approval of their governor became members of that body. For his part, the commander of Muskegon hoped to turn Emerson into a port of entry for trade between the two interstellar groups, with high government tariffs making the venture worthwhile. Delegate from New Avalon. While we were negotiating the Crucice Pact, Hanse Davion surmised that several of the other delegates, myself included, might feel it was more democratic to hold the final meetings away from New Avalon. I was flattered when he suggested my home world, Lyran. I had met Davion once before, and very briefly after I replaced the former delegate, who had taken ill. He had seemed pleasant enough, but I was completely unprepared for the impression he made upon arriving in the capital of Lyran. Previously, surrounded by other officials, Hanse Davion had little time to exchange even distracted courtesies. Now he was ready to give me undivided attention, and from that moment he appeared there was never another man, other than my husband, whose attention I wanted more. It wasn't just that he was handsome. He had been in uniform before, looking like just another soldier, but with a little more braid on his shoulder than most. Now he was dressed like a noble, and his manner showed that this was a real individual, not just a cog in some military machine. In a room filled with dignitaries, he caught my eye just as he walked through the door. He crossed the room, nodding to some, shaking hands with others as he passed, but never stopping until he came up to me. As we shook hands, he leaned over to kiss my cheek and whispered, "You," just as I remembered. What he meant by that, I had no idea, as we were both married and were there on highly official business. As he straightened up, I noticed two things about his face. His smile was crooked, the left side of his mouth turned up further than the right, which gave his expression a boyish quality. The other, truly charming thing about his face was that one of his eyes was green and one blue. From the unpublished memoirs of Duchess Ariana Fulgius, on the events of 7 November 2317. Gradually, each world in Muskegon's empire grew stronger, especially after Terra withdrew from her rebellious colonies. Trade blossomed, and Muskegon entered a period that would have been a golden age had it not been for the stagnation of the class system and greed of the empire's rulers. Muskegon had been one of the worlds that Hanse Davion visited in his campaign to form the Federated Suns. Because Muskegon had become one of the strongest powers in its region of space, Commander Giannichmead was undecided about whether the Crucice Pact would bolster his power or tend to dilute it. He did not sign the pact in 2317, but had made up his mind by the following year. In 2318, the commander of Muskegon joined the Crucice Pact. Meanwhile, discontent with the policies of the Muskegon government on its various colony worlds had reached a fever pitch. 2 of those 6 planets, Emerson and Beaton Kaitos, went so far as to refuse to acknowledge the decision to join the Federated Suns. Declaring their independence, these 2 worlds invoked the support of the Chesterton Commonwealth states. Almost immediately, the frontier erupted in conflict. Ironically, the decision to add Muskegon to the Federated Suns led to Chmead losing all that he had hoped to keep intact. Even after the rebellious worlds had been conquered by the Federated Suns, they were never returned to Muskegon's rule. 200 years later, when a descendant of Chmead's joined the wrong side in the Davion Civil War, the victors stripped away Muskegon's remaining possessions and reorganized its governments. Hanse Davion may have been a shrewd diplomat, but he was a poor general. Despite the Federated Suns' superior strength, the campaign to wrest control of Emerson and Beaton Kaitos from the Chesterton Commonality went poorly. The fighting lasted 3 years, with the 2 planets changing hands several times. In the end, Chesterton, supported by the Tychonov Union, retained control. That little war ended, but other wars along the Rhinewood March, as the area was then known, began to escalate. Several states, including the Capellan Hegemony, the Tychonov Union, the St. Ives Mercantile Association, and the Chesterton Commonalty, sought to take advantage of the Federated Suns' apparent military weakness. Disputes over claims to the important resources on the planets Redfield, Alcyon, and Daniels triggered new conflicts in which Federation expeditionary troops were again defeated and driven back. The Federated Suns' enemies soon found that it was harder to maintain their troops in forward areas than to win initial battles. Enemy garrisons along the Federated Suns' border suffered from poor supply lines and growing disaffection, making them prime targets for a counterstroke. At that crucial moment, however, the Federated Suns failed to mount such an effort. Against the background of this failure in foreign policy and the threat of further border wars, Hanse Davion decided to retire in 2332. He died a mere 3 months later, his health and spirit broken by what must have seemed the imminent collapse of everything he had worked to build. Hanse Davion became the new Prime Minister of New Avalon and President of the Federated Suns. Lucien was dismayed by the methods of his youngest brother was using to balance the interests of the Federated Suns against those of New Avalon. From his deathbed, Lucien wrote to his son Reynard, who was serving in an expeditionary unit on the St. Ives frontier, warning that it might be dangerous for the Davions to attempt to dominate the Federated Suns the way they controlled New Avalon. The message, if not the actual warning, proved strangely prophetic. The tyrant of Muskegon. When Gianachmede, the last commander of Muskegon, was overthrown, it marked the end of a dynasty whose cruelty was unsurpassed anywhere outside the Bandit Kingdoms. Yet, it was not malice that led the Achmede family to rule with an iron fist. They simply believed that it was the most pragmatic, efficient way to rule. One of the most glaring examples of the Achmede tendency to place efficiency above humanity occurred in 2293, during the reign of Hanse Achmede, the 14th commander of Muskegon. A young, unmarried mother left her baby just olive the outermost guard's station on the doorstep of the commander's house, the seat of government. She had attached a note to the baby's bassinet, begging that the child be raised as a member of the commander's household. Upon hearing of this, Hanse Achmede thundered that if he took in one baby, every unwed mother on Muskegon would appoint him her baby's godfather, and he would never have time to govern the people. He ordered the baby killed and its body placed on public display as an example to those who tried to interfere with the efficiency of his administration. When the baby's mother learned of what Hanse Achmede had done, she came to the commander's house, screaming in grief and anger that she would never have left her child if she'd known that he was a man without a heart. He made an example of her, too. From Tyrannis Excelsis, Early Territorial Governments in the Inner Sphere, by Brendan Walker E., Rimworld's Press, 2913. Charles the Reformer. I agree that our new Prime Minister is more than a bit of a snake. If it takes a snake to make the Federation strong, then I, for one, am ready to lie on the ground and hiss right along with him. From a letter by Chief Magistrate Michael Fairborn of Augusta, in a letter to his wife, 2333. Hanse Davion, though handsome and charismatic, shared none of his brother's ideals. He wanted power, both for himself and for the new Davion dynasty, that everyone denied but that all feared. Under the tutelage of Louis, the most manipulative of the Davion brothers, Charles had become a talented politician even before Lucien's retirement. After Lucien stepped down, the brothers won the presidency for Charles by dazzling the High Council of the Federated Suns with both the Davion name and extravagant promises to restore order on the frontier. Next, they secured the Prime Ministry on New Avalon to keep their power base fully intact. Only then did Charles reveal his true nature. Arrogant, quick-tempered, and energetic, Hanse Davion transformed the loose association of Crucice-packed planets into an interstellar organization that would one day tower over the other governments in the human sphere. Through the force of his will, he overcame numerous obstacles to carry forward his master plan of making himself and the Davion line indispensable. One of Charles Davion's most important actions was a complete reform of the Crucice Pact's military provisions. Until now, the Federated Suns had responded to outside aggression or internal rebellions by raising a new expeditionary force to deal with each new crisis. Member worlds contributed either troops, supplies, transport, or other facilities. A vote of the Council established the force leader, and the President set strategic aims, with the advice of the Council. The outcome of the Muskegon conflict had demonstrated just how poor these arrangements were. The memory of those defeats along the border persuaded each member world to give Charles Davion a handful of elite military units, which he used to create a Federated Suns standing army. The new Federated Peacekeeping Forces FPF had its own system of ranks and organization, and its own support structure to manage supplies and transport independently of the member planets. To foster morale and identification with the new armed service, Davion ordered extensive troop training and indoctrination to focus their loyalties and pride on the Federated Suns rather than on their individual home worlds. Many Avalonians, however, ended up in the senior ranks of the officer corps, thanks to Davion family influence. Using this kind of backroom favoritism, Charles and his brothers began to guarantee the transmission of power from Davion to Davion for several decades to come. Also during this period, a formalized bureaucracy began to supplant direct rule by the President and the Council. The Council retained control over policy matters, but routine, day-to-day operations fell to the permanent staff at the capital of the Federated Suns. Here, too, New Avalon's representation was disproportionately high. Charles Davion did not live to see these reforms fully implemented. Like Lucien, he spent much of his term settling interworld disputes and campaigning for his ideas among member worlds. His brother Louis had been his chief deputy until 2337. When Louis died, Joseph, the fourth Davion brother, was in failing health. Thus, Reynard became deputy prime minister instead. Charles had not made Lucien's mistake of failing to clearly designate an heir. Because Lucien's son was the sole offspring of the four brothers, Charles the Reformer knew the continuation of the family's power rested with Reynard. In 2340, the second president of the Federated Suns died of a heart attack while informing the Council of his plan to send the new FPF into action on the Chesterton frontier. Though many Council members recognized the value of Charles Davion's reforms, he had not been personally popular. His bias in favor of New Avalon, in everything from political appointments to judgments in the Federation High Court, had earned him considerable opposition. Though Reynard did not come to power because of his predecessor's popularity, as had Charles, nothing could stop the Davion juggernaut. 2 decades under such strong leaders as Lucien and Charles Davion had been enough to bind the Federated Suns into a tightly woven net of trade and economic commitments. At every level, from the military to the bureaucracy, New Avalon's Suns held the posts that kept the interstellar trade lanes open. There were regular FPF garrisons on a number of key worlds that were not yet members, and few local units present to contest these strategically or economically valuable points in a showdown. 8 years before, it had been the Davions who had kept New Avalon preeminent. Now it was the people of New Avalon, eager to retain their prominence within the Federation, who wished to keep a Davion in power. Thus, in 2340, Reynard Davion was elected Prime Minister of New Avalon and President of the Federated Suns. Tempus Tardas. It has taken the Davion government centuries to develop the system of checks and balances that underlies its federated system. In the early days on New Avalon, for example, the Council President could tamper with decisions of the High Court because of a short-lived legal principle known as Tempus Tardas, or time slowed down. The principle came into existence during a series of cases involving colonists who had been late in taking over claims staked by their agents on other planets. These colonial developers were deliberately allowing arable lands to lie fallow while they waited off-world until the property values had risen in the food-poor colony. At that point, they planned to step in to make a killing. Once the precedent was set for the president to interfere with the High Court in tempus tardus cases, it allowed him to interfere in any civil case, which made the president de facto chief of the Federated Suns judicial system. It was not until 2764 that the Prince of the Realm had to relinquish this sweeping judicial power. From legal decisions through the ages, by Jaipur Vivensa, Teleburrows Corporation, 3027. The War Leader. My family has served you since the very beginning, and it will continue to serve as long as this august body is willing to accept our aid. I am not my father. I do not have his record of achievements to prove my worth to you. What I can offer you is my heart, my soul, my flesh, and my untiring devotion, not only to my own world, but to any world that seeks the protection and the freedom of these Federated Suns. Hanse Davion, in his acceptance speech before the Federated Suns High Council, 2340. Hanse Davion was as charming as his father Lucien, and as ruthless as any of his three uncles. Like Charles, Hanse knew how to get things done in the face of opposition, and he had few scruples about how to achieve his ends. Nevertheless, his correspondence reveals that he was as sincerely devoted to the ideals of the Crucis Pact and to the two covenants of New Avalon as his father had been. He was also the first of the modern Davions to show evidence that he had inherited the military prowess of his ancestors. Even the soldier Robert Davion had never been in a high enough official position to employ any military abilities that he may have inherited. Hanse was a veteran of the frontier wars, having achieved the rank of Major in the Federation Expeditionary Force of 2334 on his own merit. Prior to becoming Deputy Prime Minister, he had served as a colonel in the FPF. By the time Hanse came to power, the conflict along the Capellan frontier had been raging for 20 years. Lucien had fought the war against his own better judgment. Charles had kept it going to create a threat that would justify his sweeping military and political reforms. Hanse Davion resolved that his presidency would end the conflict, but he was determined to do it from a position of strength. In 2344, confident of his position in the Federation, Hanse left New Avalon to take command of the reserve task force being gathered at Aquinar along the Capellan frontier. While two of the task forces distracted the forces around Mirac with demonstrations of strength, the reserve task force penetrated to the planet Olmec and severed the supply line that supported Mra and Msartime. The sudden ferocity of the attack after more than a decade of desultory fighting overwhelmed the Tikhonov forces. Moreover, the strain of meeting attacks on multiple fronts prevented the enemy from mounting an effective resistance. Perhaps no one was more surprised at these successes than the FPF itself. Having demonstrated the muscle of the Federated Suns, Hanse now looked for the means to a peaceful settlement. Though it was the Tikhonov Union that he had defeated, Davion's first negotiations were with the more important and more powerful Capellan hegemony. In 2345, the two powers signed the Akala Pact, a mutual non-aggression treaty intended not only to promote peace and trade, but also to create a forum for settling future border disputes. It is likely that Davion saw the possibility of eventually absorbing the Capellan state through diplomatic means. If so, he failed to understand the Capellan character. Their motivation for signing the pact was to prevent losing any of their worlds as the FPF probed deeply into their sphere of influence. Both sides apparently entered into this agreement solely to win time for military preparations. 6 months after the signing and ratification of the Akala Pact, the Federated Suns Council was called upon to approve another agreement with the Capellan leaders. This was the Olmec Accord in 2346, which gave the Suns formal control over the Chesterton worlds of Mra, Msartime, and Olmec. Reynard Davion did not wait for the Council's approval before implementing the terms. It would not be the last time that a Davion assumed the prerogatives of the Council, or that the Council allowed him to get away with it. The Vanishing Tuckers. After much deliberation, it is the finding of this commission that Ambassador Tuckers's ship was sabotaged. The only question remaining is who the saboteur may have been. In reviewing the evidence carefully, we find that the ambassador intended to report to the Prime Minister that the Davion regime perceived weakness along the so-called Capellan March that could be exploited, that Reynard Davion intends to establish a dynasty far more extensive than any his family has yet enjoyed, that several weakly defended Capellan worlds would make profitable additions to Davion's empire, and that Reynard Davion's alleged settlement is a smokescreen to prevent any attempts at preemptive strikes on our part. In short, we find that Ambassador Tuckers's ship was sabotaged by pro-Davion agents to prevent him from alerting us to Davion plans to annex Capellan worlds along our mutual border. From a confidential report by the official Capellan Commission investigating the disappearance of Ambassador Fasa Tuckers, 2363. The disappearance of Ambassador Tuckers is a profound embarrassment to the Federated Suns government. The Capellan government will inevitably suspect us of duplicity, despite President Davion's assurances that a final agreement has been resolved. It may be that the need for the President to renegotiate the agreement and perhaps arrive at one less advantageous than the current version is not the worst outcome of the ambassador's tragic disappearance. Indeed, the worst may be the impossibility of renegotiating anything at all. This leads us to conclude that Ambassador Fasa Tuckers' jump ship was sabotaged by anti-Davion fanatics attempting to embarrass and discredit the prince and possibly to depose his rule. From the report of the official Federated Suns Commission investigating the disappearance of Fasa Tuckers, 2363. Declassified 2438. After securing control of the 3 planets, Reynard established settlements on Mra and Msartime, despite Mirak's claims to these worlds. He also named them independent member worlds of the Federated Suns, which gave them a higher status with their conquerors than they had enjoyed as Chesterton trade worlds. Mech, on the other hand, was made a Federated Suns trustee. Reynard intended to build a gigantic military staging area there against the chance of renewed war on the border. With the border wars settled, Reynard returned to New Avalon and his normal presidential duties. The next years were mostly peaceful, with the Federated Suns expanding through political rather than military means, and devoting its energies to economic and social improvement. In 2363, hostilities again erupted on the Capellan frontier. The events leading up to the crisis began in 2357, when Reynard occupied the Sana supremacy planet of Bel and demanded the immediate transfer of Chesterton and his spire from Sana. This set off a chain reaction within the Capellan political arena. The Capellan Prime Minister Julian Du was forced to retire, which propelled the dynamic Saluk Tuckers into his place. Tuckers began immediately to do whatever necessary to unite the various disputing Capellan states against the common foe. It took him 5 years to carry out all his plans to secure his back, but by 2363, he was ready to confront Reynard Davion. In March of that year, Tuckers renounced the Akala and Olmec Accords and demanded that Davion return all the Chesterton province worlds that had been ceded to him. He also recalled the Capellan ambassador home from New Avalon. In a final defiant gesture, Tuckers upped the ante by demanding that Davion relinquish control over the Lee system. He claimed that a long-standing trade agreement with Lee was sufficient reason for his demand that the planet rejoin the Capellan fold. Originally settled by Capellan colonists from New Macao, Lee was within the region granted to Davion by the Akala Pact. This same world would continue to be the focal point of many Davion/Capellan campaigns to come. Fasa, the Capellan ambassador to the Federated Suns, never reached home after his brother called for his return. His jump ship vanished mysteriously on the return voyage and was never seen again, despite serious search efforts by both sides. Declaring his brother's death could only be a deliberate Davion provocation, Seleucus mobilized his army. The Capellans called on member states of the Suns to depose their false and treacherous leader, and to join the Capellan states. None took him up on the offer, and when Hanse Davion proclaimed a state of war, the vote of confidence was unanimous. The new border conflicts went on for several years, with the Federated Suns taking most of the honors. When the FPF turned back Capellan attacks on Lee, the political repercussions toppled both Prime Magistrate Tuckus and his government from power. The more the Capellans suffered internal dissension at home, the easier it was for FPF forces to continue their advances. When the Tikhonov Union and the St. Ives Association were drawn into the war as well, they, too, lost worlds to the Federation. Hanse Davion conducted the strategy of the fighting, this time from the capital. When the FPF succeeded in retaking Redfield and other planets lost during the First Border Wars, he was satisfied that the Federated Suns had finally laid to rest the military humiliations of his father's day. In 2367, a new government, the Capellan Confederation, was formed from the numerous smaller states that had suffered in the recent wars. Intoxicated by his military victories, Hanse Davion refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new realm. Diplomatic relations were not established, and desultory fighting continued along the frontier. 2 years later, in 2371, the 64-year-old Hanse Davion died from a recurrence of Black Marsh fever, first contracted during his soldiering days on Galitzin. His son, Etienne Davion, was elected to both of Hanse's political posts without demur. The Davion dynasty was finally and unquestionably established. The first 3 Davion presidents had made the Federated Suns one of the major powers of the Inner Sphere. The army that Charles had forged had proven itself in battle. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy of the Federated Suns had been centralized to ensure a continuity of administration even during times of trouble. The early Davions also left a legacy of problems. In particular, their foreign policy toward the Capellan Confederation would plague the realm for centuries to come. In fact, the Davion invasion of several Capellan worlds in 2366 foreshadowed the Age of War, during which each state of the Inner Sphere was at war with all the others. Editor's note: the creation of the Federated Suns was the first such alliance among the many worlds of the Inner Sphere. During the 24th century, 10 such separate states evolved, each with a strong central government. Some came into being through the need for mutual cooperation, but others were forged through military conquest. With its relatively large population base, easily obtained raw materials, and a tradition of many centuries of scientific superiority over the other states, the Terran hegemony maintained technological superiority over the other states. This also bolstered its political influence, particularly when dealing with worlds lacking in such fundamental necessities as water or croplands. As the century wore on, each state became more and more adamant about defining its borders, with border disputes becoming both frequent and intense. Struggles over strategically valuable planets escalated from small skirmishes to battlefields covering an entire world. Scientific research again turned away from improving the quality of life and toward research and development of new weapons. In the final 3 decades of the 24th century, many border worlds went from being equipped with navigational aids and glorified police officers to having sophisticated ship detection equipment, fully armed KF-drive jumpships, a variety of system defense craft, and large garrisons of crack troops. The Age of War would soon rear its ugly head. The tyrants. Perhaps House Davion was too successful too quickly. If they had not risen so rapidly to absolute power within the Federated Suns, Their line might have produced more leaders qualified to fulfill the duties of rulership. From the very start, the Davions began to function as a dynasty, but with no provision for screening out the unfit or ensuring proper training or preparation. When fate brought forward a fool, a weakling, or a tyrant, there was no choice but for the family, the planet of New Avalon, and the Federated Suns to accept him. All too often, a ruler's flaws did not show up until after he was in power. From the Davions, a family portrait, by J. Bickman, Capella Publishing House, 3008. Many people said that the marriage between Reynard Davion and Jean Remix was a mistake. In later times, the superstitious even claimed that it was a cursed thing to mix New Avalon first family blood with that of a common farmer from another world. There is no denying that Etienne Davion and his two children were unstable, yet Paul, Marie, and Paul's descendants showed no taint of the so-called demon strain attributed to Etienne's branch of the family. The truth is that the Davions, like all families, produced their share of bad apples. Etienne's weak character could not sustain the rigors of supreme power, while Edmund and Edward, his twin sons, went bad because of poor upbringing. Nor was this the only time power would corrupt the line. The Davions would spawn other tyrants, just as they would produce their share of noble idealists in the years to come. Following the death of Reynard Davion in 2371, the fortunes of his family and of the planets that looked to the Davions for leadership took a sharp turn for the worse. For the next half-century, the Federated Suns would find itself in difficult straits, becoming in turn the plaything of a madman, the squalid of a scholar, and the captive audience of twin egotists with a taste for luxury and power. Only one ruler out of Reynard's 5 successors was fully stable, and only 2 tried to provide the Federated Suns and New Avalon with satisfactory leadership.